All right. So, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Esteves. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay by using your reactions, all right, or just a regular physical thumb. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is really Grassroots convening about housing justice, instability, and criminal justice, or the criminal legal system, and active organizing and advocacy going on in the greater Boston area in Massachusetts connected to that work. Today, you will hear directly from grassroots activists, organizers, and leaders involved in those two arenas. And for some of them, a lot of that work overlaps. So what we're going to do first is, instead of having everyone introduce themselves, we're going to do a quick breakout room in smaller groups so that you can kind of get to know a few people, and then we'll bring everyone back, okay? So please click the link that pops up on your screen saying join breakout room, and we'll send you to your breakouts for about a minute and a half to 2 minutes, just so you can introduce and get to know some new folks. And for anyone who is stuck listening to me, you're just stuck listening to me, or if your breakout room didn't work. Andres, can you hear me? Oh, can you? There you go.
I can, yeah.
I think did I make you a co-host? Oh, no, yeah, you could. All right, everyone's in their breakout rooms. All right. And for those who are watching the live stream, just know that the breakout rooms, they're just introducing themselves, learning who they each other are, and then we'll come back to the full group. All right, welcome, welcome. For you folks who are here, we are in small breakout groups, but I'm about to bring them back. But we just wanted to allow everyone to kind of get to meet a smaller group of folks instead of doing introductions amongst 30 plus people. So. All right, so welcome back, everyone. I hope that was, a little useful just to start your Monday morning, getting to know some new and unfamiliar faces. So what we're going to do is start first with our criminal justice folks. So joining us, and I believe I've done everything I need to do to make them co-hosts so they can unmute themselves. We have Fatema Ahmad from the Muslim Justice League. You can wave for the crew. We have Mallory Hanora from Families for Justice is Healing, and Leon Smith from Citizens for Juvenile Justice. So if everyone could, if the three of you could take yourselves off of mute, we can go ahead and get started. All right. Yes. So the main questions, so really the way we structured it is essentially, we have three key questions, but first I want to offer all three of these folks an opportunity to share who they are and what their organization what work that they focus on. So Fatema, did you like to start?
Sure. So I'm Fatema. I use she, hers pronouns. I am the executive director at Muslim Justice League. I live in Dorchester, and MJL is, Boston based. Our office is downtown, but a lot of our work in the communities that we focus on are, people of color, primarily communities. So Dorchester, Roxbury, East Boston, and around the state. We also do a little bit of national work. Our organization turned 5 this year. It's our 5-year anniversary. And we are, founded by Muslim women, led by Muslim women. And we really focus on organizing and advocating for communities whose rights are threatened by like the national security state. So any type of national security type policing, surveillance, and criminalization is what we focus on.
All right, Leon or Mallory?
I'll go. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leon Smith. I'm the executive director at Citizens for Juvenile Justice. For the last 25 years, we have been the only independent nonprofit statewide organization working exclusively to improve juvenile justice and other youth serving systems in Massachusetts. Our mission statement is statewide systemic reform that achieves equitable youth justice. We acknowledge that juvenile and criminal justice systems have never been, nor are they currently fair or equitable. And while we push for reform, we must center the issue of equity in that drive. We do our work on a systemic level through really 4 pillars. Advocacy, we're known for our legislative work, but we also work with folks on the local level and the city council level as well. Coalition building, we host the Mass Juvenile Justice Coalition, which has 63 members across the Commonwealth. Research, our advocacy is based in research and data, and public education. It's just an honor to be here today with our allies in the criminal justice reform world. But really, when you look at our role, we're the ones who say, don't forget about the kids in that conversation, looking at the profound impact that many of these policies have on young people who are still developing and coming into their own.
Thank you, Leon. Mallory?
Beautiful. Thank you so much. My name is Mallory Hanora, and I'm with Families for Justice as Healing. We're so honored to be part of this conversation, and we're really grateful for the support from the Lenny Zakim Fund. And I see a lot of folks that we work with regularly on the screen, so I'm very happy to be with y'all. So the mission of Families for Justice as Healing is to end the incarceration of women and girls in Massachusetts, period. So we believe we can do it. Right now, more so than ever, there's a historically low number of women who are incarcerated in Massachusetts. That number is 443 women. And we believe that working together, we can find a better place for every single one of those women. And we can also stop the flow of our people into jails and prisons. So Families for Justice as Healing was founded by Andrea James and the women she was serving time with inside Danbury Federal Correctional Institute in 2010. And Andrea made a commitment to her sisters inside, not only to organize while they were together in prison, but also to continue fighting for women when she came home from prison. And all of those women, Sister Virginia, Taz, Tahiba, who were in federal prison, are now organizing all over the country as part of the national formation that they founded, the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. So Families for Justice as Healing is a very proud founding member of the National Council. The organizing that's happening here is in some ways a model for what's also happening around the country. And when Andrea founded Families for Justice as Healing in 2010, there was, the beginnings of a much louder national conversation about quote unquote mass incarceration, right? And women were entirely left out of that conversation. So there was a real need to be unapologetically focused on women and the unique needs of women and what are the root causes of women making contact with the criminal legal system. And also for Families for Justice as Healing, we continue to be led by incarcerated women. We have members inside Framingham Prison right now, as well as inside South Bay Jail. We're led by formerly incarcerated women, and we're also led by women with incarcerated loved ones. So we like to say we are freeing her we are also freeing all the people that women and girls love, right? All of the people that have been taken out of our homes, our families, and our communities. And I can talk more about our programming probably with the next question, but that's who we are and what we do. We're proudly based in Roxbury, and we're a statewide organization.
Well, thank you all, everyone. So for us, this was an opportunity to share. We have a mix of folks who are familiar with these issues and some who are brand new, but very interested in willing to get involved. So the next question, and I'll toss it to Leon first, is, what's the most pressing issue that you're working on currently? So some of you have active advocacy going on around pending legislation. So please feel free to elaborate on either active legislation and policy or just the most pressing issues that you're working on currently.
Yeah, so to really streamline, we have a racial justice action plan that features 11 bills currently before, but if you really put those into certain buckets, I would define those in 3 buckets. You have accountability and transparency. You have juvenile justice system reform, which really encompasses our Raise the Age campaign, as well as our work in expungement. And then obviously police accountability and reform, which has been something that we've been fighting for years, but has really risen into the spotlight with the recent incidents involving George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Accountability and transparency, it's been something that we've been driving at CFJJ for the last 16 years, because Massachusetts is a perfect example of why collecting data at every decision point disaggregated by race and ethnicity and other identifying characteristics is so important. We're one of the least transparent states in the country when it comes to data collection, and it really detrimentally impacts our ability to evaluate bias in our systems. When you look at race data in young people, we have the 6th worst racial disparities in the country. The Sentencing Project did a report back in 2015, which found that Black youth are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth. In 2017, a detention utilization study showed that in Massachusetts, Black kids are 91% more likely to be detained than white kids, even when you control for charge type, age, and gender. So the stereotype that, well, of course those kids are incarcerated, they're doing the most serious offenses, it didn't hold up under analysis, because even controlling for the same type of offenses, Black kids are more likely to get locked up and they stay longer once they are. There's a long-standing history of law enforcement, the courts, and system agencies just refusing to be open and transparent. And, as we had this conversation about racial justice, it has to be said that you don't solve institutional racism by hiding information or making the impact of people's decision invisible. You have to put it out there, you have to own it in order to address it. So we do have a current bill, and I'll give bill numbers at the end, that would mandate demographic data at every decision point, not just on race and ethnicity, by geography, because we know that some counties are more punitive than others, and also by sexual orientation and gender identity status. And I have to mention that especially during this month, because we know that LGBTQ young people, especially girls, are extremely disproportionately represented. When you look at our juvenile justice reform, Raise the Age is so important, because when you look at the entirety of the adult criminal justice system, our single greatest failure is in our emerging adults, those 18 to 24-year-olds, and particularly those 18 to 21-year-olds who are transitioning into adulthood. That population has the worst recidivism rate in the entire adult criminal justice system. 76% of those kids are rearraigned within 3 years, and 55% of those kids are reconvicted within 3 years. What we're doing isn't working. When you look at the cohort of 18 to 20-year-olds who are committed to the Department of Youth Services up until age 21, only 22% of those kids are reconvicted, which shows us that when you keep teenagers, 18 and 19-year-olds, these are still high school age kids. When you keep them in a juvenile justice system where they have access to education, access to job skills, access to adequate counseling and therapy for the issues that they do not get in the adult criminal justice system, they do better, and that recidivism rate falls. So there's a current bill sitting before the legislature that would gradually, over a period of years, bring 18, 19, and then 20-year-olds into the juvenile justice system, which would then, we believe, greatly improve outcomes for the kids as well as improve public safety. And then I have to mention expungement. When you look at tools that can rectify just the documented systemic racism that exists at every part of the criminal justice system, we believe expungement really has to be at the center of that. People will say, well, in 2018, wasn't expungement a part of it? Very limited. It only applied to one charge on the record. I've been a criminal defense lawyer for 20 years. I know that oftentimes my clients would have charges stacked. It happens so much when I practiced in Roxbury and Dorchester. We used to call it the unholy trinity, because if you had a bad encounter with the wrong police officer, you weren't just getting charged with disorderly and breach of peace. You were getting charged with resisting arrest, and you were getting charged with assault and battery on a police officer in some cases. That goes beyond that one case. We also know there are people who are charged improperly and their cases get dismissed, and yet they still have to answer for that on that court. So what we want to do is greatly expand the ability of non-convictions and non-adjudications to be expunged, as well as expending opportunities beyond that one conviction. That one conviction, for, the young kid who, does one thing, maybe that works, but for our kids, particularly our urban youth, the way that they're policed and the way that they're often overcharged, that excludes a broad base of those young people from being able to expunge their records. So I don't want to take up too much time. Again, I'll be sharing the link to our action plan and all, but those are really some of the key racial justice pieces that we're looking at.
Thank you, Leon. Fatema, would you like to pick up on that? I know you've been doing some work around the gang database as well.
Yeah. Excuse me, sorry.
No problem.
I want to start with a couple of things, because I think folks sometimes hear about our work around the Boston Police Department and might not understand like what we really do around criminalization and what that means. And the way that I like to think about it is there is this whole, spectrum of processes that happen that are, violent and that punish people. So I don't think of it as, a criminal justice system. I would never use the word justice for what we're talking about. And, we work with folks like Families for Justice Healing and other folks who focus on different parts of that system. So we're very focused on how people are criminalized and policed. And when we say criminalized, we mean, the ways that we view each other, right? It's not just police that actually decide who is quote unquote criminal or quote unquote violent. It's our teachers, it's our mental health professionals, it's, social service workers who are trained and sort of deputized by police, and are obviously swimming in the white supremacy that we all are swimming in, right? That then ends up criminalizing and policing people. So a question for you all, if you can raise your hands to this, have any of you ever felt frustrated with US foreign politics? Just raise your hand on screen if you have. Cool. Have any of you ever gotten involved in political organizing and political movement work? Should be all of you. Cool. Have any of you ever worn clothes from your ethnic background? Yeah. And have any of you ever gone to church regularly or another religious institution regularly? Cool, thanks. Okay, so you all are on a path to becoming violent extremists. If I was doing my duty by the Department of Homeland Security, I would ask Eric to, give me a list of all your emails. And I might split you all up into different programs to help you off of this path to radicalization. So some of you, say you're students in a school in Massachusetts, you might need to take some trainings on how to like avoid scary Muslim extremists online. Some of you, I would recommend that you need to talk to a therapist who is actually going to, let us know how you're doing, because obviously we're really invested in your well-being. And some of you need to be trained on how to talk to police. So some of you will need to go to an after-school program where you'll learn how wonderful the police are, how you shouldn't be afraid of them if you're a Black youth, and how you should, be able to talk to them and share what other kids in your neighborhood are doing. I hope that sounds absurd to all of you. I hope I don't have to explain why that is horrible. And that is unfortunately what Massachusetts is a leader in doing. So there's something called countering violent extremism, which is this framework that criminalizes people. It uses this really just complete nonsense pseudoscience idea that if you have radical beliefs that you are inherently violent or potentially going to commit violence. And that really goes back to just the idea that anyone who is political is radical, right? The way that we actually define who is radical or who is a terrorist is not really based on the kinds of violence that they're committing. It's based on like who is the other, right? And how they relate to a system of white supremacy. So unfortunately, Massachusetts is a leader in this. There's like millions of dollars of programming, including all the things that I just said. So the Boston Police Department for a few years now has been doing these trainings with Somali youth specifically. There's a nonprofit that does these trainings in schools. That's really terrible. And there are lots of health professionals who get trained. And often these people are convinced that this is going to help, right? They actually go towards like helping professions and convince them that this is helpful in some way. But what you're really doing is entangling people in, with law enforcement from an early age. And you're also reinforcing this narrative that some of us are inherently violent and that we have to like be trained to like not be that, or that we can't be political. It also like suppresses Muslim organizing in particular. So that is that's the main thing we work on, and it is urgent right now because it's a federal level program and they just relaunched it like after there was a lot of discussion about getting rid of it for various reasons. They relaunched it during the pandemic, which is like highly offensive for the federal government to be spending $80 million on this thing again that Muslims have been organizing against. So during Ramadan, which was like a month ago, we led a campaign, a digital campaign about that, and we're going to continue that advocacy. We lead a national network of folks that organize against that. We also organize against it here locally, but that ties back to why we work on the gang database and these other policing issues. So our organization is not about just organizing Muslims, it's about justice by Muslims for everyone. So everyone who is criminalized and everyone who is impacted by anti-Muslim systems. So the gang database in Boston is run by a counterterrorism department that only exists because of Islamophobia. It was created after 9/11, and it allows the Boston Police Department to just work with the FBI and Homeland Security and all these other agencies with no oversight. And they're the ones who run this gang database that has vast majority Black men in it. Both Black young men and Black adult men are the vast majority of people in that gang database. And so we don't think that anybody should be on a watch list or a registry. That the gang database really functions as a registry of Black and brown people in certain neighborhoods. So yeah, one of the main things we've been working on, sorry if I'm going on too long, but is the Defund Boston Police Department campaign that hopefully many of you have heard about. And when we say defund, it's not just about cutting money out of their budget. It's about shifting power away from a system that punishes and, perpetuates more violence towards people, right? Like, we should have control over our resources. And it's also about just taking power from the police. So we're the kind of group that uses abolitionist principles. We're not interested in reforms that just allow the police to get a rubber stamp on what they're doing. So one of the things we're advocating for is end the gang database and completely eliminate this counterterrorism department. We shouldn't have, we can't pretend that we're a sanctuary city when we have something like that exists. So yeah, I think best way for folks to get involved is just keep up with that work. There will be more to come. We just, the budget situation happened last week, so we're taking a little time to rest, but there will be so much more to come on that.
Thank you so much, Fatema. And then also for those who are on the Zoom, I posted a link both to CFJJ, Muslim Justice League, and then also I'll be posting the link to Families as Justice as Healing as well. So Mallory?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Leon and Fatema. It's always wonderful to be in conversation with you all and learn from you all, and there's so much overlap in our work. I appreciated Fatema zooming out for a second, so I also wanted to just start with the framing and share with you all that Families for Justice as Healing, we're an abolitionist organization, which means that we are working for communities that can exist beyond policing, courts, and prisons, right? And so we talk a lot about what we need to destroy, right? What we need to dismantle, but we learn from all of our teachers, Black women leaders for generations who have been talking about abolition as a presence, like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, and like Miriam Kaba teaches us, we're actually trying to create the conditions in our communities that make a world without police and prisons possible, right? That makes so that everyone living in our communities has everything that they need to live well and to live healthy and safe lives, right? That make incarceration actually impossible, because we have other ways of meeting people's needs and healing from harm, which we know that incarceration never does. So for our organization, we're aware that incarceration is always harmful. That's the framework from which we do our work. We're also aware that communities, most impacted communities, have the solutions inside of themselves with their life experience and expertise to actually be able to take care of each other. So while we're a statewide organization, our base is absolutely the most incarcerated communities in the Commonwealth, and the most incarcerated corridor is from Nubian Square up through Roxbury and Dorchester to Franklin Hill, Franklin Field. And that's where the base of our members come from. And we've been building multiracial support and coalition across the Commonwealth. And one really beautiful example of that was in 2018, we passed primary caretakers legislation as part of the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act. Primary caretakers legislation was written by formerly incarcerated mothers, and the lead organizers for that campaign were daughters of incarcerated parents. And it was a really beautiful movement of most impacted people saying what's really needed is alternative sentencing so that we never separate parents from their children with incarceration. So it's now the state law in Massachusetts. It's been implemented in several other states as a model based on what we did here. And the National Council is leading that movement to implement the law across the country, including at the federal level. And what it does is it allows a person who's being prosecuted and then convicted to ask the court formally for an alternative sentence so that they can heal and advance their life while staying connected with their children. Actually, in Massachusetts, alternative sentencing is a totally normal practice. It's just who gets access to those sentences, right? Who gets alternatives and diversion instead of probation, who gets probation instead of incarceration. So we actually know that the only area of the criminal legal system where Black and brown people are underrepresented is in diversion and alternatives. And so there's a huge need to continue pushing for other ways of holding people accountable rather than sending people to jail and prison. Primary caretakers is just one tool to do that. It's something that we already achieved. And one of the ways that we achieved that was actually most impacted women saying, this is exactly what we need and this is what we're fighting for. And then then women across the Commonwealth backing them up and saying, you know what, that's important to me too. And making calls to their senators and their representatives and saying, even though I'm not from a most impacted community, I want you to know that this is a priority to me. And we went across the state and we asked people from all backgrounds and said, do you feel safer because somewhere across the Commonwealth, a mother is separated from her child, right? A mother's not able to care for her children because she's incarcerated, and had those really real conversations. And that's part of the base that we've built now of power across the Commonwealth to keep advancing our goals, which is to end the incarceration of women and girls. So Eric asked us sort of our pressing issues. So first and foremost, releasing people from jail and prison is a pressing issue for Families for Justice as Healing. We are absolutely committed to decarceration, and we just want to, I know what people's families are struggling and suffering in different ways, and our incarcerated community continues to be in the middle of a pandemic and an absolute humanitarian crisis presided over by the Department of Correction. So I'm sure you've seen some articles floating around that half of the women incarcerated at Framingham, half of the women contracted COVID-19. And while there was one related death, that is one too many. And then we're talking about aging women and women with underlying health conditions living with the impact of infection for the rest of their lives, right? And the health vulnerabilities that exist because of infection. We're also talking about women that are living in a toxic building, including a building that has mold and asbestos, which directly contributed to respiratory issues prior to the infection of COVID-19. And women were especially vulnerable then to COVID-19 infection and the worst outcomes. And that is another example of the way that the Department of Correction in Massachusetts has never taken care of people in their custody and continues to abuse their power and the resources given to them by the Commonwealth. There is now an outbreak at Norfolk Prison, which is some of the oldest people incarcerated in the Commonwealth, including many men who have been incarcerated longer than I've been alive. Friends of mine, elders in our community, taken out of the community when they were 19 and 20 years old, continuing to serve sentences. Men who were sentenced at a time by all white juries, over-sentenced and overcharged by white judges during some of the times of worst racism in Boston that, of course, continues now. But we're talking about disproportionately long sentences. And these are the population of men who are now being impacted by COVID-19, as advocates have always said they would be. We have been saying since we heard about COVID-19, we must release people from jails and prisons, which are the most dangerous places to be during an outbreak of such infection. So we're continuing to push for release. One of the pathways to that is clemency. So for our brothers and sisters that are serving life sentences, clemency is one of the only doorways out of the system for them. And that's something that the governor is in complete control of. He can commute anyone's sentence at any time, and he has chosen to commute absolutely no one's sentence. We're talking about grandmothers who have served over 30 years. We're talking about women who have colostomy bags. We're talking about women who cannot walk without walkers, canes, and crutches. This is the group of folks that are most vulnerable to COVID-19, who frankly have been incarcerated for too long anyway, and we were fighting for their release even before COVID-19, and we continue to do that now. So we want to open our minds and our hearts to the idea of decarceration at every single decision-making point. What are all the ways that we can prevent people from ever touching a jail or prison bunk? And what are the ways that we can free our siblings from incarceration who have frankly done way too much time already? So the focus of our clemency campaign is every single woman who has served more than 10 years, every single woman who's a survivor of domestic and sexual violence, every single woman who's older than 50, and every single woman with underlying health conditions. So that continues to be an active part of our work, is freeing our sisters, even in all the ways that we try to prevent women from being arrested and convicted in the first place. And we hope you can join us to that. We have an active clemency campaign, and I'll share links in the chat. You can sign our petition and you can join our work to do that. And of course, we don't forget about our brothers at Norfolk either. This week, we'll be doing a week of action to demand that the Department of Correction release people on compassionate release, which is fully in the control of the DOC, by the way. So when we talk about elders who are sick, elders with leukemia, elders with asthma and respiratory issues, elders who have had strokes, these people are not being released because the Department of Correction is choosing to continue to incarcerate them, and they could choose to release them. So I'll put our link of action Oh, thank you, Fatima. I appreciate you. Our week of action is really intense, I'm going to be honest, but what is so cool about it is that it breaks down actions for you all to take at every level of the system, city, county, state, and bringing in all of these decision makers who have control over our communities and our loved ones and say, free our people. So there's ways to get involved on every level, and we really invite you into that. The past few weeks, as Fatima mentioned, have been super city focused, recognizing that Black and Brown communities continue to be under the occupation of policing and trying to liberate communities from that through every angle, through the budget, through changing police policy. This week, we're going to have a little bit more of a state focus because there, as Leon mentioned, there's some pressing legislation that's before the Ways and Means Committee right now. And there's also an active outbreak of COVID-19 in the prison system. So the second thing that I want to talk about in terms of pressing issues, right, is this idea of addressing harm outside of the criminal legal system. And that's been a priority for Families for Justice as Healing since our inception, right? The Black and Brown women that founded our organization, policing in prisons has never worked for our communities, and we know that. And now Families for Justice as Healing is in a beautiful process led by most impacted women, including women who have been incarcerated, including women whose children have been murdered, and leading a process to develop ways of healing from harm outside of the system and addressing and responding to that harm. So that includes prevention, intervention, and healing, right? And so women are taking curriculum from abolitionist comrades across the country, developing our own local processes for what makes the most sense in Boston, and then continuing to build that out. And that's been happening really quietly for a long time now. And part of the reason it's quiet, right, is to protect that process for the people that are closest to that pain, building that power based on what works for people in our own neighborhoods. And we also are developing a men's group space that's been meeting regularly now as well, because we as women know we can do our part, right? We can start with the women, we can start with our children, and then men are continuing to build that out and interrupting harm between men, addressing harm and healing from harm. So Families for Justice as Healing is incredibly serious about developing those alternatives to policing and prison, right? Not a number that we can call that's outside of our community from sort of a top-down approach that is still really institutionalized within the city, right? But a process within communities, a self-determined, community-led, Black-led process for communities to be able to say, this is what we need. This is the roots of why folks are experiencing policing, right? This is the type of harm that people are going through, and this is what would work to stop and interrupt that harm. So that's an active process in Families for Justice as Healing, and I just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of times people think that maybe isn't going on at all, or we're waiting for someone else to figure it out for us, or we're looking for just 311 to do it, or we're looking for another number to call that's coming from somebody outside of our community is going to come in and fix something. And we know that that's not the reality, right? And that I wanted to just lift up and affirm the leadership of Families for Justice as Healing members figuring out those processes. And the last pressing issue for us is, or a category of work that I just want to share and talk about, is reimagining communities, right? What's it going to look like? What does it look like for people to have what they need? A thriving, beautiful, healthy community where people want to be outside, where people can be together safely in public space, hopefully very soon, much closer together, right? But co-op businesses in neighborhoods, grocery stores owned by the people on the block where the grocery store is, employing people from the neighborhood in the grocery store, healing that happens within the community by providers that look like the people that they're serving and have gone through the experiences that the people that they're serving have been through, really building out a vision for what thriving communities look like in order to address what both Fatima and Leon talked about, which is generations of disinvestment in Black and Brown communities, where the only source of funding coming into the community is through a police force or through incarceration. So we're talking about Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, where literally millions of dollars per square mile are spent on incarceration. MassInc did a report from 2015 data, and I promise you that the increase in spending from 2015 on incarceration has actually been exponential. Well over 100 million more dollars since then on DOC, and tens of millions of dollars more per sheriff's department. So we're talking about now millions upon millions per square mile in cost related to policing and incarceration. But what does that look like? What would it look like to have millions of dollars per square mile controlled by Black and Brown residents, invested in what Black and Brown residents have identified that they need in their own communities? And so that's what reimagining communities looks like to us, is, as Fatema said so beautifully, shifting power and resources away from policing and incarceration and into the control of people living in their own neighborhood for their vision of what different looks like. And we've started to do that through the People's Budget process. So Families for Justice as Healing led a listening tour for a year. It was a 1-year-long participatory research process, interviewing 150 women from the most incarcerated neighborhoods, like I mentioned, formerly incarcerated women and women with incarcerated loved ones, to get their beautiful vision of what they want in their community, to just take all of that brilliance and expertise and put it into a report form, that so that people can really see what women are looking for and needing for our families and our communities, and building off that directly into a People's Budget process that we're leading at both the municipal and the state level with some of our partners on this call. And I know, Mimi, the brilliance that Andrea always says, the brilliance Mimi has in her pinky finger is like, if we could just get that. So we're bringing communities together on different issues, right? Housing is absolutely one of those issues that women are demanding. That part of our organizing is like, people need places to live, right? And the criminal punishment system completely restricts those options that people have to live with their own loved ones and live in their own communities. We're fighting against that, right? We're fighting for funds in the community for people to not just work for someone else and feel jeopardized by their Corey status, but build their own businesses and hire their own people that meet the needs of the neighborhood. And that's going to come through a People's Budget process of demanding millions of dollars to be controlled by the people that are coming from these neighborhoods, right? Controlled by Black and Brown people directly. And that was part of our demand through the Boston City Council organizing process, was that we wanted 10% cut from the Boston Police Department budget, but we wanted that $41 million into a fund directly controlled by Black and Brown people from the most police neighborhoods in Boston. So through a participatory budgeting process, we're still scaling that up. So if you go to our website, I'll put a link in the chat. You can see the first version of the People's Budget, but we meet weekly. So most impacted women are continuing to meet, coming right out of the listening to our base building project into a People's Budget process that is going to continue to issue demands and visions for the city budget and for the state budget. So that's what reimagining communities looks like to us. That's what it means to take power and resources away from incarceration and invest in all the things that prevent people from ever getting to a jail or a prison bunk, including those alternatives to incarceration, but just also including jobs and housing so people have what they need. And so that is I hope that's a good enough overview. There's totally a lot going on. We also have programming 5 days a week that we've been running on Zoom. So we're doing a lot just even for our individual members, but we're really pushing for systemic change with a lot of the folks on this call right now. We're joining Fatema and some organizers trying to disband both the gang unit and the gang database. I'll share the rest of our list of policing demands. And just as a last note, we're also fighting, sounds simple and small, but we're in a humanitarian crisis right now, like I mentioned, from COVID-19. Our siblings incarcerated have not had visits since March, and they have been on 23-hour lockdown since April 4th. So free phone calls and visitation are absolute musts to just maintain our human loving relationships with our incarcerated family members. So we're pushing for that legislation as well. And we hope that that gets included into everybody's racial justice platforms. We've been fighting for that since last year. Families said this is most important to us, and we have an opportunity to really keep families connected through no cost calls and visitation whenever we get to see our people in person again in visiting rooms. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mallory. We appreciate that in-depth overview of all that's going on and all that's so pressing and important. So it's a lot to take in, and what we're going to do now, even perspective, but it's pretty connected and very, very, very much intersectional in a way. So we're going to start off with Andres del Castillo from the Right to the City Coalition, as we pick up the theme of housing justice as well, and housing stability, especially in the greater Boston area, and a lot of the coalition work that's going on locally. Andres?
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Andres del Castillo from Right to the City Boston, he, him, his. And thank you so much to those previous speakers for raising that issue and also raising the intersectionality between that issue and housing, because we see it a lot. We're not just in how folks who are formerly incarcerated struggle to find housing, but also the loved ones of folks that have been incarcerated struggle to even have them over. Like it's not even as deep as having them live with them. Even having them visit can get you write-ups and get you put into an eviction process. So really, really powerful. Thank you for speaking to that intersectionality. I've been an organizer in Massachusetts for a little bit over a decade now, organizing on issues ranging from LGBTQ rights to immigrant rights in the first half of this last decade, and housing rights, housing justice in the latter half of this decade. And now I'm at Rights of the City of Boston as senior organizer. Rights of the City of Boston is a multi-issue based alliance of organizations that represent low-income people of color and immigrants in working class communities. And we're working together for social justice on a range of issues: Alternatives for Community and Environment, Chinese Progressive Association, City Life Vida Urbana, New England United for Justice, have all come together under a platform of values and principles that include the right to a stable community, the right to economic justice and good jobs, the right to democratic participation, the right to the public good, the right to a healthy environment, among others. And using those principles, moving a cohort of other organizations and volunteers into a participatory process of people's assemblies, in which we've been gathering folks from across the city to really have a deep democratic process, deciding what are the value sets that we want to materialize into political demands, and how do we move that together forward and have our communities really have a stake in and a role, a really deep role in how we plan for our city and plan what our city is going to look like in the future. And so through that lens, before COVID-19, our alliance was doing those people's assemblies. And obviously, as I'm sure everybody on this call has also had to do, and folks are, around the world at this point, a lot had to shift in reaction to COVID-19. And I think for a lot of our organizations, as well as our partners on the ground, there was a lot of mutual aid and immediate assistance work that had to happen. I know that, in the neighborhood of East Boston, we had a lot of leaders just cooking immense amounts of food to distribute to different homes that were severely impacted by COVID-19, East Boston being one of the early epicenters of this virus in the state of Massachusetts. And also kind of using the foundation that we'd laid out before the crisis to really take advantage of this moment and ensure that we were able to implement the right protections for our community. We were really able to exercise our power in that way and get the strongest moratorium in the country, or what's being called the strongest moratorium in the country, passed here in Massachusetts, signed by the governor. But all the protections that it gives run out in August unless the governor extends. And so we've been shifting our attention to phase 2 legislation, which would not just expand those protections and include more, but also deepening those protections, but also extend them further out, which would extend those protections 12 months past whenever the state of emergency is lifted. Among those protections, it would ensure that no person is going to be evicted for a non-payment. That non-payment during COVID-19, during the state of emergency, is not basis for an eviction. That doesn't mean that debt won't be able to be collected in other ways. And we're also pushing in the bill language to protect how the debt will be collected, so that it doesn't become an abusive tactic that others use, but it cannot be or would not be a basis and grounds for an eviction. And so there's those protections and others that I'm sure other folks will speak to in a minute, that we're trying to expand on and ensure that they last well after the state of emergency, because we already have the Boston Globe and other major media outlets predicting tens of thousands of eviction cases to begin as of the first month when the state of emergency is lifted. And so we know that there is a tsunami of displacement headed our way if we don't act now to really stabilize the conditions for that. We also know that I grew up, my mother's a domestic worker. I grew up hearing the political circles and policy talk about what my folks do as low-skilled workers. And we've had this whole COVID-19 crisis really shift the narrative to essential workers. But we're also experiencing in the community how much work is essential. Because if we don't pay rent, we're conditioned to think there's nothing we can do. We're going to keep kick that on the street. So we've got a lot of our community members having to go to work to find food, to get the resources to buy food. A lot of the federal government resources and state resources that have been put out do not cover undocumented folks, do not cover immigrant communities, and being held outside of those resources really exposes our folks. So ensuring that in the protections that we're putting in there, immigrant communities and working class people of color really can take advantage of those protections and really can be educated about knowing what they are and how to exercise them. So all of the organizations at Right to the City are putting out to their base through their meetings and their calls the information about what these bills include and how members can prepare now and also in the future, using mutual aid as an opportunity to really organize. And I'm sure that others following me will talk a little bit more about what organizing on the ground is looking like in this moment. So right now we're at a major opportunity. We are really pushing this phase 2 legislation, which includes also protections for homeowners, so that in this moment, whether or not you have tenants or you yourself just as a small homeowner in a single family are being impacted, also have protections around foreclosure and the banks coming after you. So it's been a lot. I think we still have a lot of work to do to move forward from the people's plan and into the people's budget, as Mallory was speaking to. We at Right to the City are very excited leading that work and moving that work forward with all these amazing partners. And we definitely want to move that work ahead, and also are recognizing that this COVID-19 crisis, requires a certain level of attention right now, and that these policy proposals right now just would make a huge difference in our communities if we can make them reality. We've been really successful with this moratorium, and so it's that thing that happens with organizing. When you can accomplish something, you only just raise the bar higher. And so here we are saying, well, we got the moratorium, let's go for phase 2 legislation.
All right, well, thank you so much, Andres. So next up, we have Isaac, who's from the Lynn United for Empowerment Change Project. Isaac?
Great, thank you. And so appreciate the work of everyone who's already spoken. It's really inspiring, and I know there are lessons that we're learning from the folks working in other sectors. There's so much overlap in terms of the organizing model. I think we've got a lot to learn. So the group I work with is Lynn United for Change Empowerment Project. We are a social justice group based in Lynn. We primarily work on housing issues, on the human right to housing. And our model in some ways is similar to what folks have spoken about. We, on the one hand, intervene where people are struggling with an immediate threat of eviction, foreclosure, loss of housing, and try to provide direct, whether it's legal aid, whether it's peer education and support, sort of triage, information sharing, things that'll hopefully hold off that immediate crisis. And then on the other hand, we try to link that work with the movement building, with bringing people into the broader social justice work that's going to change these systems that are the root cause, and try to support people in becoming leaders and becoming active in different aspects of that social justice work. And yeah, we kind of try to service a bridge of, the sort of casework, the really micro level stuff that needs to happen with the much broader range organizing. That's the only way we're going to actually get at the root causes. And I just want to share briefly a flyer that is one of the outreach materials we've been using, because I think it encapsulates a lot of what we've been dealing with during this crisis. So let me see if I can. I got so many tabs open. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that. So this is, one of the flyers we've been using. I think it says a lot about the both how we've had to respond and the strengths and also some of the weaknesses. So as Andres mentioned, we've got the strongest eviction moratorium in the country, which was an important victory. And I'll say a little bit more in a second about the role that different groups in our sort of emerging coalition, Homes for All Massachusetts, played in that. But that's sort of the first thing on the flyer is, we know that that law is great, within the bounds of the current system, it kind of pushes as far as we could go. We need to go beyond that. But unless people knew about it, they were still being threatened by landlords. People were still, being intimidated and being pushed out, or being pushed to take on really risky methods of trying to find money to pay rent because they didn't understand or hadn't heard about the terms of the moratorium. So that's sort of the first bullet point. And if anyone's on the phone, I'll just read the headline of the flyer is "Can't Pay Rent or Mortgage." And point 1 is "Don't panic, evictions are banned." The second point, help paying rent will be available. And then it gives a phone number to get help applying for rental assistance. And I think this is both a sort of strength and a weakness. We found, and I think a lot of other groups around the state found, that the state's main rental assistance programs have, never been adequate. And like a lot of other things, this crisis has more fully and dramatically exposed the systemic failings that have always been there. So for example, in our city, the RAF program, which is supposed to help people catch up on rent or avoid displacement because of missed rent, the application process required people to use this fairly complicated online form as the only method of applying, of getting into that system. And it was just such a crisis that a lot of our base that we work with could not get access to that critical source of funds. We jumped in, and I know other groups have done this, and took on the role of helping people apply, which on the one hand was just a necessary intervention, because a huge number of immigrants, particularly undocumented folks, or more recent immigrants, a huge number of people who had less access to technology or lower income, people who weren't necessarily literate in English or Spanish. All those groups were just being essentially excluded by this inaccessible system. So we jumped in, we did that. It certainly has made, we think, a difference, and it's been important work. It's put us in contact with a lot of folks and built relationships on the one hand. But to be real about the challenges here, it's drained a lot of capacity. And I think that's one of the things that we, and I'm sure every group in this call struggles with, is in order to do the emergency response work and also continue doing the system change work, the movement building work, it's a huge challenge capacity wise. And I think it's exposed that we need to build up more capacity to be able to hold both of those roles at once. So I think we've done our best as we can with it in Lynn, but certainly, some of the work and some opportunities to push the organizing further have not been things we've been able to sort of capitalize on because of that drain on capacity. And then the last bullet point here, join the fight to cancel rent. Again, like Andres mentioned, we're moving from the fight for that moratorium on to try to push in a second phase of something that will protect against a wave of evictions that's expected in the early fall. And I think Noemi might talk a little more about this later, but just the sneak preview is we're hearing predictions of like up to 20,000 evictions filed or in process immediately after the moratorium lifts, unless we do something. So that's what we're working on. But again, that sort of comes back to our model of bringing folks who are facing crisis, who need a help, information to avoid eviction now, help applying for rent help right now, to try to also say, look, those are the leaders that we need in the system change effort, and trying to bring those folks into that struggle. So let me see if I can figure out how to stop sharing. So I think, that's sort of where we're at in this moment. I want to talk just briefly about the moratorium victory. So Andres mentioned, we've got this really strong moratorium. And there were many groups around the state, and I'm sure many people on this call who were an important piece of that. It really was such a broad-based effort. It was critical. One thing that I think enabled that in Massachusetts that maybe wasn't as present in some other places is that we have the sort of seeds of a statewide coalition that has real leadership from people who are directly impacted by housing instability, and has strong participation from base building groups, whether it's our group, whether it's City Life, and other Right to the City groups in Boston, whether it's Springfield No One Leaves across the state. And the formation is called Homes for All Massachusetts. That coalition was just sort of getting built as the crisis hit. So we were in a good position to bring together the many different strands of progressive responses to this around housing and focus it in on this moratorium and make sure that the details of the moratorium law really responded to what we know from our base building work on the ground was needed. There were so many moments in the negotiation process for that legislation where there were compromises people wanted to make. And it was so critical to have at the table and sort of anchoring the coalition work, folks who deal with eviction on a day-to-day basis and were able to say, well, okay, that's a compromise that can be lived with if it needs to be. But this other one that, some of the more conservative folks in the State House are proposing, we've got to draw a line and say absolutely not, because we know on the ground it'll mean, just undermine the effectiveness here. So I think it was really critical that we had that emergence of Homes for All Massachusetts. So many other folks were involved in housing efforts, but it was sort of scattered and didn't have that anchor of folks who knew on the ground what things were like. I want to shout out the Mass Community Actions Network and groups that aren't necessarily focused solely on housing and maybe have a different organizing model, but were great allies. And I think the Homes for All contribution was to bring that into focus on what do we need on the ground. So I think I can leave it there, and I think Mimi and others can pick up what's going on next in the phase 2 push to head off this awful tsunami of evictions that we're looking at, in the early fall.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. Speaking of tsunami, it's pouring rain where I am. But before I pass it on to Mimi, just wanted to thank her for helping me kind of brainstorm and conceive of this webinar today. And then also we've had at least one question. So if the folks who are on the panel can take a look at that question, we can get to that after we hear from Mimi.
Great, Eric, thank you so much. And honestly, thank you to everybody. It's super dope to see everybody this morning, this afternoon. I know it's Monday and we have a lot of work on our plate, but this was really, I think, an important conversation across the board, right? So that we have space to kind of learn from each other, share with each other, and really begin to dig deep around some of the important and amazing work that many of our leaders and organizations are moving. So thank you again to the Lenny Zakim Fund and to everybody for taking this time today. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about myself. For those who know me, I don't talk about myself a lot. So I'm grounding myself with our members and community. But Mimi Ramos, I'm the organizing director with New England United for Justice. We are a 10-year-old organization that really moves as a neighborhood organization. Our work is centered with residents and families who live in Dorchester, Mattapian, and Roxbury. Much of our work is citywide, statewide, depending on the issue. One of the challenges, but also beauties of NEU4J is we are, a multi-issue based organization, and we really take on a variety of issues that really matter to our members and to our leaders. So we work on a little bit of everything. At the core and what we are known for is housing justice, worker rights. We do neighborhood building, and really how civic engagement and electoral community power is embedded in all of it. We're multi-issue, multi-generational, and cultural space. At the core, our leaders are primarily Black and Brown residents who really, are homeowners, are renters, are small landlords and workers who really just believe in having a seat at the table and being a part of the solution around the issues that impact their lives. And, you know, I've been very proud to be with the organization now for 10 years. I can't believe I'm saying that out loud, but for 10 years. And, you know, it's been an honor to really be an organizer, an advocate, and a listener, right? And leader in our communities for over 15 years now. So it's been quite a journey. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the issue of housing in a different way. You know, you heard a lot from Andres and Isaac, and, you know, to both of you, it's been awesome to see you in your leadership and be a part of Right to the City, and also the work that Homes for All is now building. But I wanna kind of bring us a little bit back and just give a little bit of context around housing and what we're actually talking about, right? So housing has been an issue over decades across the country. That's no secret, right? And we have all experienced and or know of families who have experienced the squeeze of housing at some level, especially here in Boston. It's no secret that the housing system has not worked for our people, primarily for low-income Black, brown families. And, you know, one of the things that I really value about the work that we've been doing, both at our neighborhood level, as well as connected to some of the larger spaces, is, you know, we're tired and we're done. And I think, you know, as we center ourselves around our belief to housing as a human right, you know, we believe that, you know, development is possible, but we want to take a stance around development without displacement of residents and families, and also the belief of what it means to really bring renters, small landlords, and homeowners together to protect our rights to housing. That has not been an easy conversation and has not been an easy shift, I think, even for Right to the City over the past couple of years, but one that we have taken on with honor and have really dug deep into over the past couple of years. I think one thing that's important for me to bring up is, you know, housing is not just about housing. Housing actually connects many, many issues into one agenda for our community. And we can't really win the types of housing that we want to see without really thinking about how the other issues really tie into this work around housing justice. It's connected to how we think about land use and land ownership. It's connected to the fight for good jobs as new housing is built in our communities. It's connected, and you've heard Mallory and many others talk about, you know, the needs for families to have a roof over their head as they're coming back home from being incarcerated, the impacts that residents have now to even access in housing because they might have a quarry record. And I also think about housing in terms of how we govern ourselves, right? And how we govern our own community as renters become small landlords and homeowners, and how do we really support each other collectively across the board. I think it's really important, right, that sometimes we take these really big political issues and we want to really, you know, think academically about them. And I know that's really important. And again, for those that know me, you guys know I'm going to try to bring us down a little bit, right? We're talking about a roof over our head. We're talking about a place to raise our family. We're talking about a place where we can maintain and build our roots in our community, and a way for us to continue to work and play in our own cities, right? Like, that's what we're actually talking about. But I do think for far too long, you know, housing has been used as a political platform for personal gains of candidates running for office. I think that, you know, we need to be bold and not afraid to push our elected officials at a city level, a state level, and at a national level around housing policies that really center those most impacted and that really are about protecting and grounding our communities where they live and where we come from. I also think that for far too long, housing has also been about those who have money and those who don't, and the reality of those who want to make money off of our people in our communities. And we really need to stand differently around those folks, and primarily these larger corporate landlords that half the time don't even live in our community, right? And I think one thing that, you know, we need to be looking at is not just one policy. Like, this is not about one policy for us, right? This is about a menu of policies that really are needed for us to have the type of housing that we want. When we think about access to housing, the fight for affordable housing, how do we increase home ownership, and also services and protections that tenants need, not only especially right now, but in the long term. And so, you know, one of the things that's been really exciting for us is, you know, we represent small landlords, homeowners, and renters. right? And that always hasn't been an easy conversation on how do we unite our communities around what housing justice looks like. And across the state, as we're hearing from partners like in Lynn, in Springfield, in Worcester, in Chelsea, you know, we know that we can't win the types of changes that we really want in our communities without thinking about a statewide force around housing. There's a lot that our city can do locally, but not enough, right? And I think that as we're thinking about, you know, how do we build stronger cities and tenant organizing opportunities at a local level? What does that mean collectively when we come together, which has really been, you know, the center focus of why a Homes for All space needs to be built. And then on the ground, you know, we're doing a little bit of everything. We are doing training and education of our members on, you know, really understanding how development works. What is the role of the city and the state around development? How, you know, how do residents kind of step into leadership and when development planning comes into our community? And then we've been taking that and really thinking about, you know, what does it mean for us to look at some of these larger policy fights that we also need that are gonna kind of match the support that we need at a local level. I know that sounds like a lot, but really we need to be looking at this neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, and then statewide, what are we doing collectively? And that's been some of the work that we've really taken ownership of, and it has not been easy, right? Let's just be honest. I think one thing that's important for me to bring into this conversation is prior to COVID, we were already having conversations around statewide, what do we want to do together? And I'm going to mention the dirty word of politics because that's what I say it is, even though I'm like, it's no longer the dirty word of politics, but rent control, right? So we've been already talking about what would it take to run a rent control, rent stabilization campaign prior to COVID. We had already been exploring ways to work with each other, which has been great. Not only was MCAN a powerful force statewide, but also groups within the mass voter table and really linking housing justice and civic engagement, right? Around some of the rent control conversations. But when COVID hit, right, not only did that work not stop, because I just want to highlight that we're not stopping the work on rent control, but we had to shift, right? And we had to shift with, okay, COVID's impacting our communities. We know that folks are not working. We know that folks have been losing income. We hear on the news constantly the number of families right now on unemployment. Our people need protections right now. So the moratorium fight for me was like the first phase, but it was really about the Band-Aid on the bleeding wound, right? Phase 2 is an extension of the moratorium, but really looking at a year's worth of protections, because we can't just say, okay, the state of emergency is lifted and everything is going to go back to normal. It's not. And for our communities and for many of the members that we represent on this call, we know that it's going to take some time to heal financially from what was going on. Let's keep it real. Our folks were struggling before COVID. They're struggling more even now, right? And so us looking at phase 2 is about long-term protections. And even longer than that, what we're seeing right now is there's a real opportunity to unite renters, homeowners, and landlords in a way that we just haven't seen before, right? Because the opposition's always being painted as, well, we're the small landlords and we're worried about X. And actually, it's not the small landlords that are there speaking all the time. It's usually these larger landlords that are putting out their message and their fight because they're nervous about what real accountability looks like when it comes to housing in our community, right? And so I'm really excited to be a part of this team. There is a lot of work to do at a neighborhood and local level, but statewide, we need everybody's help on this call. I think, you know, Isaac and Andres painted a picture on the policy side of what we're doing, but this is an opportunity for us to link our issues together, for us to call our state reps and senators and say, look, now's the time. You want to support the community and meet us where we're at. Here are the types of protections that we need. I know, Isaac, I don't know if you were able to share it on the chat, but there is a letter we're asking organizations to sign on to and to honestly help us make a call for this kind of phase 2 of housing. I think long-term, y'all, rent control is on the table and it's been moving now and we can't ignore that, right? Some people say, is it rent control or is it rent stability? We say it's all of it, and that we need to be looking at this across the board. But it's gonna take the strength of everyone and to really move these types of issues and to continue to unite our communities around what housing justice looks like across the board. So we're really excited to continue to organize in these spaces and in these conversations and to figure out like what's the next phase of housing after phase 2 passes, because I have a lot of hope and faith that we're going to move this bill in the next couple of weeks, especially as the moratorium protections are going to be lifted as of mid-August. So we really don't have a lot of time, but I am encouraged by all of you that we can make some moves together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mimi. You could be an organizer or you could be a preacher. I can't really tell the difference. But we definitely appreciate your words of wisdom that you had to offer. We've gotten just one question in the chat, and it's kind of an overlap between both issues. I know from just in reading it, I'm familiar with the Mandela experiment, which was an initiative where Roxbury, basically there was a bid in the early 90s to basically separate Roxbury as its own city named Mandela, but failed, whether it was a ballot initiative or just through an election. But essentially, does anyone else want to speak to that question around other cities surrounding Boston of similar size to some of Boston's neighborhoods, and basically, the limitation of power and who represents neighborhoods directly? Anyone want to take that question on? How does that arrangement help or hurt these Boston communities?
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I'm trying to like fully understand the question. I think is this the question by Sonia?
Yep, I can just read it again for everyone to hear. And for those who can't see it, I recently realized that Boston as a municipality includes a lot of neighborhoods that could reasonably be seen as independent cities: Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, etc. In contrast, Cambridge, Somerville, Malden, etc. have their own budgets and elections that allow these cities to manage themselves. How does this arrangement help or hurt these Boston communities? On one hand, I can imagine it could help distribute tax funding to communities with generally lower income, but it also feels a bit like taxation without representation. Would establishing these communities as independent municipalities offer opportunities to address issues like policing? And is it even a feasible consideration to do so?
Mallory, go ahead.
Oh, I have no idea. I would want to research all that. But I just like Dorchester, Roxbury, Power, like all for that 100%. So I'd want to know what that looks like. I do think that I think that the current, and a lot of counselors talked about this in this round of budget negotiations, and for 100 before then, we've heard that for those of us who have been doing this for a long time, is that we live in a mayor strong city. And so even when there are representatives of Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan who are opening more than ever to the demands of the people, their options to do something with those demands are limited. But I don't want to let anybody off the hook in terms of what's possible through a combination of reforming the charter, but not only that, establishing ordinances and repealing ordinances that limit the power of Black and brown neighborhoods. And I think something that we're working on at FJA is doing a survey of existing ordinances related to policing, for example, but just starting there. And then what ordinances could be possible, for example, a ban on all forms of pretextual stops, including vehicle stops and stop and frisks. So I think there are ways for the city council to use their power in a way that's much more representative of Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan, but there's genius expert organizers on this call that I think one of our charges is just building more together. Like Mimi, I would love our members to be coming to these workshops on development, would love to be able to offer y'all members something as an exchange, like love to be in the conversation about supporting. We just signed on to the letter, so thanks for sharing that. But Sonia, great question. I think we got to get creative, and the demand is power for Black and brown neighborhoods, period.
I agree and echo everything that Mallory said. I think one of the larger challenges that we have, and I don't know the answer either, like what would it take and really, would the community even want it, right? Like, I think we need to start there on any and every issue, like really listening to our people, having an open dialogue and honest conversation about, is this something that they would want to do, right? So first line of what we would need to move. But I do think that there's a real conversation at the state level as to why our cities don't have the power to really make the types of changes that we want. We all know that home rule petition has blocked many, many fights and many policy victories that we want to see. Right. So why do we have to go through a 200, 300 person body so that a Boston or a Somerville or a Lynn or a Springfield can make the types of changes that we want on any issue? Right. And so I think we need to like really look at that, understand how home rule petition came about and how we think about changing that so that our municipals actually have more power to govern themselves. Like that for me has been, you know, a conversation that we've heard over time. So I think that's something that collectively we need to be looking at differently.
All right. So seeing that we don't necessarily have any additional questions, just wanted to offer parting words. So the way we really wanted to structure this conversation was also allowing our guest featured speakers to share if there's any particular help or ways in which allies and accomplices can help further the work that you all are doing. So either action steps that you'd like people to pursue. So, you know, for example, the week of action, I believe that Families for Justice Healing is doing. There's a letter that you, Homes for All, that you want folks to sign the petition. Anything else that hasn't been shared yet, please feel free to share. And any you know, final words in terms of action steps that you're taking or would like external support from. And, you know, just for myself, just want to, you know, this will be my wrap up. The Zakim Fund, you know, we're a funder that raises money to then give out, but also provide capacity building support, focus on social, racial, and economic justice. And this video will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. So it'll be accessible later on.
Can I just add, related to what Mimi just mentioned around home rule? I think that's, you know, it's such an issue. The probably key example in the housing arena is around rent control and how, you know, the statewide push by real estate interests decades ago, you know, undercut the will of the people of Boston, Cambridge, and potentially other cities that wanted to implement or continue rent control. You know, there's really clearly a class and especially a race element of, you know, that being a really fundamentally racist kind of structure where you have, you know, these predominantly of colored communities, you know, being overruled by, you know, mostly votes from whiter and wealthier areas. So, you know, it's such a huge problem. It can also cut, you know, that state local thing can also cut both ways, because I just want to point out the governor just recently reintroduced this quote unquote housing choices proposal he has, which is a sort of neoliberal approach to creating more housing and, you know, solving the housing crisis in a way that's, you know, based on markets and based on privileging the importance and role and power of real estate interests and wealthier people, and not taking into account the importance of preventing displacement and protecting local communities. And one of the ways they're doing that, they want to push that, is by making it easier for cities and towns to change their zoning when the zoning is designed to enable new development. Typically it's, you know, luxury type stuff that's profitable. And at the same time, they're not going to make it easier for cities and towns at the local level to have inclusionary zoning or requirements around affordability. So I think it just sort of points out, like, we've got to take on the home rule issue, but we also have to recognize, you know, they're sort of playing both sides of it, and there's no way around, you know, the statewide coalition that we all need to keep working to build.
And we just got a question, other than pushing for the bill to arrest the lifting of rental relief, what is the Zakim Fund and other funders doing to help renters meet rent payment assistance? So just to answer answer that directly. So the Zakim Fund, we don't do any direct work, but we did launch an emergency fund, and we have granted out funds to about 45 organizations, many of whom are providing direct cash assistance to either their members or network, and others who are, it's been a part of the funds that they've launched as well. So that's just a direct answer to that question. Anyone else want to share any final action steps or resource assistance that you could use?
Yeah, I mean, I would only just add to that last question that I think it's critical for the resources that we're able to push out to our communities that they can use as much of those resources for basic needs like medicine, food, whatever else is needed in the house, and that we can attempt as a state to ensure that they're not held liable for rental payments during this crisis. Because we, there are assistance programs going out, and we also don't want our families choosing. And I, before being at Right to City, was at City Life answering hotline calls, spoke to multiple mothers literally crying because they didn't know, do I pay rent or do I buy groceries? So the situation has gotten really dire, and it's really important that we don't frame assistance or necessarily always fall into a space where we're framing assistance around rent. There's ways in which the state can back small homeowners and back tenants so that relief lasts long term, and we can then rearrange how we're spending those resources and give our communities the flexibility that they desperately need in this moment for allocating their own resources and governing that for themselves.
Definitely. I'm just really inspired by that, and I would love to learn and build more. And just to add to that, I had thrown it in the chat, but I wanted to lift up our members are coming to us saying exactly what Andres is saying. But in addition to that, I owe rent, I need to buy food, and I have months of probation and parole fees that are now stacking because those are just piling up. So it's people are facing a wall of just the deferment idea is limited in the sense that somebody's going to have to pay at some point. So I think at EFJA, we're going to be thinking about a support fund for those type of fees and want to be in radical community around how we can sort of pass that on, but that's just another layer. And I think we always flag, and I know y'all are on the same page, but for folks listening, like we always flag that making sure that funds are never restricted based on any type of identifying, any type of disqualifications related to, your CORI, to your citizenship status, to anything that would restrict people's access.
No, and I think one thing I'll just say on this level is we've been saying this whole time, we have to think about wellness or mutual aid work tied to the organizing, right? Like when we give out our hot food or our grocery bags or a gift card to help families with, whatever they may need, they're also getting information on the organizing groups that are in their neighborhoods and how they can be involved in the fight, because long-term, that's what we're gonna need. I know I can offer families a plate of food right now and it's gonna help for the moment. I know I can give them support to getting groceries for a month, but that's not the long-term fight. And we need to make sure that we're marrying wellness and organizing conversations across the board. I really, really, truly believe in that. And the only thing I would just say ending this call is that, I know that we're all working from home and, some groups are going back in, some groups aren't. We're still struggling with what's about to come again, as we're hearing potentially a second round of COVID. But I just encourage us, like, as we have teach-ins, as we're doing trainings, get them out there so that member leaders can access these calls. Like right now, we have members on this call right now because I wanted them to hear from our folks who are focused on the restorative justice work, right? And so I think, this is about how do we take advantage of this moment and these online tools, also recognizing that online is not for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. We got seniors, and I'm also very proud that my seniors are like, well, we're going to try it. You're not going to tell us we can't do it, right? And so, I just want to throw that out there, that we just, learn from each other, engage with each other, and as much as we can connect our fights, because this is the other challenge that I think that we just have, right? We don't connect our fights as strongly as we need to. Right. And if I'm talking to state rep so-and-so about X on our issue, I should be able to say, and here is the platform or the work collectively that we want to move. Like, we need to become stronger about how we're doing that so that we're moving one story and one solution and not multiple.
So one final point for me, bringing back to the criminal justice issues, two really quickly. One, the gang database came up. That is also a priority of ours, particularly around the barring the sharing of information, student information with fusion centers. We know that was a big issue in Boston public schools. Also requiring parent notification if a young person ends up on a gang database. There are kids who've been sent into that, whose information has been sent to that database and parents have had no idea, and that's simply not okay. Also, as it relates to the conversation around divesting funds from law enforcement, it's important that we also have our voice in how that money is then reinvested. I'm thinking particularly around schools and divesting away from school resource officers that have become so pervasive since the 1990s. But as we pull funding away from policing, we have to also just as strongly advocate for that money to be reinvested in social, emotional supports for our young people, because our young people who have experienced trauma need those supports within the school building to support them in being able to do the best that they can do in their education. So that's just my last point.
Thank you.
Go
ahead, Fatema.
I was going to say my last point briefly, agree with everything that folks shared. I would say, you know, some easy steps is one, definitely check out the toolkit that FJA has so that you can keep up on those weekly actions, because I think getting people free immediately is super, super urgent. And the defunding prisons work is also urgent because the state budget is still like in process versus the city budget. We will be having more, you know, city and state level policing and criminalization actions definitely coming up, and likely a hearing in a couple of weeks about that counterterrorism department that runs the gang database and their funding. But I think also just as a step that I hope everyone can take with your family, your friends, who you live with, your organization, is actually thinking through what you do instead of calling the cops. I think we often don't think about it until something horrible has happened. And so then, you know, people after mass shootings have these conversations and are like, well, how could we possibly not call the cops in this terrible situation, right? So don't wait for the worst thing to happen, because those things are really rare. But start thinking about it now, like, who do you actually call when something happens, right? Who keeps you safe in your neighborhood, and how can you build up that sense of community with each other? Because I agree with Mimi, like Zoom is just such a weird space to be in, and like right now especially, I think people need to know who can actually show up, and a lot of that is happening through these mutual aid networks, which of course happen to be many of the same people who are doing this kind of organizing work. So I think that's also a good place to be having those conversations, so people know, you know, who keeps you safe, and safe really means making sure you have housing and food and all the things you need.
Well, thank you, everyone. Especially like to thank Fatema, Mallory, Leon, Andres, Isaac, and Mimi for your time and your expertise and knowledge. And I hope you all have a great day and week. And we're signing off.